All right, friends. So we're back. We're talking about British Isles, the early years, and we're going to try to rock through this. There aren't a terrible amount of slides. There's a few, but I'm going to try to keep it to 10 minutes or less. I realize that my voice is probably a little more nasally than it usually is, so I apologize. All right. So early history. So British Isles are located on the western fringe of Europe. They're both islands, so obviously you've got a lot of coastline. There's a lot of mountains up in Scotland. There's a lot of rugged territory in Ireland and Wales, that kind of stuff. Um, and basically, there's as an island, and it's kind of in the middle of everywhere. So there's been a lot of traffic by different cultures through uh, the British Isles, right? So first up, we've got the Celts. They arrived in around 800 BC, so about 2,800 years ago. And when we talk about Celts, it's anybody speaking a Celtic language. And first it came from Germany, but we're talking about Scottish Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, Welsh, Manx, Breton, Cornish. All those are considered Celtic languages. And usually we think of the six Celtic nations. And as you can see, those are the list right there. Oops, sorry about that. The big thing that the Celts brought was their metalworking. They had forges and they brought in chainmail, body armor, horseshoes, that kind of stuff, and it helped them really take over a lot of territory. You can see a lot of countries still speak some sort of Celtic language, like the Scottish Gaelic up here in the mountain on these islands to the north. Um, Welsh, obviously in Wales, is still a big language. It's actually probably the biggest area that still speaks the original Celtic language. But we're still only talking about 20% of the population, and that's of the population of Wales. So 1 in 5 might still speak Welsh, but they all speak English. Is how that kind of works. All right. One of the things that came out of the Celts was the Celtic Druids, and you can kind of think of them as like the village elder. So they were kind of like priests, lawyers, judges, historians, maybe even doctors, all kind of rolled into one. And they did train together. They did kind of learn from each other. Um, but they were kind of, this is a long time ago, and so it wasn't exactly scientific based. You can see the Wicker Man right here. And what happened with the Wicker Man is that when people were maybe sick or maybe before there was a danger of death in battle or something like that, they would make these big Wicker Men and they'd fill them with all the sick people or people that were injured from battle and then just burn them. And it was kind of crazy, right? I mean, you could see that many people burn. Usually they preferred criminals of some kind. But it was basically a human sacrifice, is what we're getting at here. Uh, Whether this happened a lot, just looking at this has got to be, you know, hundreds of people inside that thing. But even if it just happened once or twice, it probably would be pretty traumatic if you were to witness that. Um, Julius Caesar was actually the first to write about the Druids um, as a group, and he first encountered them in Gaul, which is modern day Germany, and the Druids met their match, I guess would be one way to put it, in the Romans, right? So by the second century, they kind of disappeared from written record, mostly due to the Romans. And the Romans came in again. We're talking about the British Isles, and as different cultures, peoples came through and lived there. So Rome started their invasion in about 55 BC, but it wasn't until about 100 years, so 50 CE, that they were really able to put down roots. Mostly in Scotland and Wales, they weren't able to be there, so they were mostly in England, mostly in the lower parts. You can kind of see this in this map where they primarily were located, so along the eastern coast and southern coast. Um, Scotland's kind of hard because there's a natural border. There's some tough places to grow or to cross, plus supply lines and things like that for invasion would be difficult. Similar thing to Wales, where they have along this edge here, if you can see my cursor, there's some physical boundaries, things that are tough to cross and to put down roots and actually, it probably goes back to some of the individualism too when you think about it. I'm sorry, just a random thought, but Scotland and Wales both have a very individualistic personality. Wales keeping a lot of the same language, Scotland keeping a lot of the Scottish language, things like that. Yeah, that might be something to it too. Anyways, the big contribution the Romans did for the British Isles was their roads. As you can see in this map right here, these are some of the roads that can still be seen to this day, right? So that's 2,000 years later, kind of amazing. There was a wall. It's kind of famous. It's called Hadrian's Wall. It was 73 miles in length. This is more or less a modern picture, so this is worn down. 2,000 years will wear down a wall. But even in its heyday, it wasn't really something that would keep you from jumping over or climbing up and over. It was really more just, it'd be hard to get a horse over it or something, but it was more for surveillance, that kind of stuff. So Roman influence. The big thing Rome was there is to get resources, bring them back to Rome. They did. We talked about the roads a little bit, but there's also things that Romans brought with them. Agriculture, aqueducts, walls, things like that. They didn't necessarily take over British culture, but they certainly contributed to it, and a lot of Britons kind of adopted some of the ways they worked and lived. All right. So after the Romans, we have the Germanic tribes. So at about 400 CE, so 410, give or take, because of the fall of Rome, you have the Germanic tribes moving in, right? And you can see from the map that they kind of came in waves over 150 years, give or take. The big thing was that the land of Angles was kind of how England got its name, and Angles had little use for towns and cities. So that's this area of people coming into what is now Britain, and they named that land after them, and it kind of stuck. The big thing that we get from this period is that to help, they weren't really big on like kings or thing, it wasn't quite a feudal system, I guess would be the way to put it. They actually had a king's council, so there's senior warriors, clergymen, maybe even a merchant or two, and they would give advice and they would help the king rule. And so by the 10th century, with it, 600 years later, they actually became a formal group, so appointed by the king, to issue laws and charters and help him kind of him or her, I suppose, queen was usually a male, helped run things, and a lot of people attribute this actual specific thing as a example for the very first evidence of like a presidential cabinet or things like that. Yeah, so the Saxons, who were part of this group, they actually created different counties and shires, so each had a local administrator. They weren't necessarily the duke or the duchess, but they kind of ran things. And again, it was a little bit more of a egalitarian way of sharing power, I guess would be the way to put it. Yeah, and then after these guys, so in about the 9th or 10th centuries, now the Vikings, the Norse, came in, mostly from Norway and Sweden. They really established themselves on the coastal cities. You can kind of see by the map that they really were spread out quite a bit. But they eventually did go into France, which was going to be coming up later. The Normans were pretty successful in taking over things. So they mingled with some of the Anglo-Saxon, and so between the Norman language that they brought with them from Norway, things like that, or from the Anglo-Saxon language, and they kind of melded those things with a little French thrown in as what the English language that we know today. And so you get, the French words are given examples of, but also there's Celtic influence from both sides, and yeah. Anyways, so the next phase here is that we talk about the Normans settling in France. Now, Britain was considered
basically controlled by the Normans. But there was a chunk of them living in France, and there was a big conflict over who controlled France, right? So the Years War is kind of a big turning point in the history for France. Um, and this is pretty much throughout the whole Middle Ages. So there's a technically it's called the Hundred Years' War, but it lasted more than 100 years, right? So it was basically a battle between some English and French royal families, and who would control the throne. And as you can see here, from this first graphic in 1337, the first little chunk of green is the English power base, orange being the French power base. And as you go along, 23 years later, it grows. The English base grows, and then another, 80 years later, much of the northern part of France is taken over by the Normans. And then we go on for another 25 years, and suddenly it's all controlled by French power. Basically, what happened is that everybody died out. That's how it ended. I mean, after 100 years of warring, there wasn't a whole lot of people to fight left. So basically, what happened is France was free then to be on its own, I guess, under French rule. England actually went through something similar to that a little bit after what we'd call the Hundred Years' War. Lasted about 30 years. It was called the War of the Roses. So basically, what happened is two very powerful families were fighting over the throne of England, right? So we've got the House of York and the House of Lancaster, and there's some movies and plays about it. I know I'm a bit of a Game of Thrones fan, and actually George R. R. Martin said that he based a lot of what went on in the books about this actual event in history. So the House of Lancaster was represented by the red rose, and the House of York was represented by the white rose. And we're not really sure how it started. It could have been a personal thing, but obviously, if you're fighting over the throne of England, it's probably just because of power. But there are some doubts whether it was financial troubles or maybe the weak rule of Henry VI, or a little bit of everything thrown in, probably. But essentially, what happened is, as you follow this graphic, you've got these two dudes, right? And it starts here. But as you go down through the generations of, it's 30 years, so there's a few here. But eventually, you get down here, and Elizabeth of York, so family member of the York, married Henry the Seventh, Tudor, right? So he became king, their family, and they joined. And then we get Henry VIII as their offspring. That makes sense. So yeah, that's generally how it ended up. So we got two big battles that basically ended up with one side dying out, and this other big battle, the War of the Roses, where basically one family member married a family member from the other family. All right, so Henry VIII. So he's kind of a big bad dude and kind of famous in history. The big thing, and I'm going to try to do this really quick, all right? So he was basically wanting to be on the side of the church, right? Because he was all about the power, and the power was with the church. But how do we start this? Martin Luther was a Roman Catholic priest that didn't really agree with how the Roman Catholic Church was doing things. Like, he believed that a person should be able to read the Bible and interpret it, right? The Roman Catholic Church at the time said, nope, it's only the priests. The people should be able to do certain things. Well, you can. I don't want to get into that. We don't need to talk about difference between Catholics and Protestants. But anyways, there was something going down in 1517, and I highly agree. Highly, especially if you're a Protestant yourself, you should look it up. Anyways, Henry VIII defended the church, right? And because of that, the Pope named him Defender of the Faith, which is a really big deal. Now, a few years later, about 10 years later, he was married to this lady, Catherine of Aragon, but he didn't have male son, which is kind of a big deal to a king. And he also was a bit of a womanizer, and he fell in love with another woman called Anne Boleyn. And he kind of wanted to set aside his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and marry this Anne Boleyn. Well, he went to the church and they said nope, and he wanted to bribe them. Nope, 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 nope. And so he got kind of irritated. And so two Protestants, which is kind of important in the story, Thomas Cranmer, which is a clergyman that was, prominent in his court, and then an advisor, Thomas Cromwell, who is a pretty famous historical figure in England, both Protestants again, that he should not told the king that he should not necessarily worry about what the church says. So he goes, all right, let's throw down, and he made the Church of England, and he made himself the head of the church. So he was not the Pope, he was at the head of the church, and he named Cranmer the Archbishop of Canterbury, right? Kind of a big deal. Then that guy turned around, granted him a divorce from Catherine, and within a very short amount of time, he was married to Anne Boleyn, who was already pregnant at the time. Just throwing that out there. But so she gave birth to her daughter, Elizabeth I, and so Henry doesn't have a male heir yet. Crazy enough, Henry VIII gets sick of her and says he fell in love with another woman, Jane Seymour, wants to set aside Anne Boleyn, and Anne did not like this and threw kind of a fit, and Henry decided, you know what, this is too much trouble than it's worth, so he had her convicted and executed on charges of adultery, incest, and conspiracy against the king. So yeah, that's who that guy was. All right. Eventually, his daughter, from Anne, Elizabeth I, would become queen, which is kind of cool. All right. So Queen Elizabeth I, again, Henry's second daughter, but she became queen mostly because of the divorce and, well, we don't need to get into it, but the first daughter didn't become queen for a few different reasons. But Elizabeth I was one of the most famous and well-regarded monarchs in England. She was known as Good Queen Bess. Now, part of life is timing, right? And Queen Elizabeth I had impeccable timing as far as becoming a monarch, right? So this is the time of Shakespeare. This is the time of the Navy, and she made some good choices, right? So she chose to build up the Navy, which eventually defeated the Spanish Armada, which eventually put England on course for total global domination. So she's doing a pretty good job herself, but it also, there's some timing things that go with it. She did not ever really want to marry or share the throne, right? So she didn't want to marry one of her subjects and share that power, because as a woman, as soon as she married somebody, then they would at least have half the power or be perceived as having half the power, and that wasn't something that she was kosher with, right? She did pass in 1603, but when she did, she was one of the greatest monarchs that England's ever had. All right, and that brings us up to a little more recent times, and that's where we're going to take it in the next video.